Imagine you are standing inside a home that has not been heated for 6 hours. Outside, the temperature is negative 35 degrees Celsius. Wind is moving at 50 kilometers per hour. The ground has been frozen solid for 3 months. There is no electricity, no gas line, no insulation in the walls as you would recognize it, no chimney pulling smoke from the room, no windows letting in what little light the winter sun offers. And yet the air around you is warm, not uncomfortably warm. Warm the way a living space feels when people have been breathing inside it for generations. Warm the way something feels when it was designed from the ground up, never to be anything else. How is that possible? That is not a hypothetical scenario. That is what archaeologists stepped into when they excavated Viking longhouse remains across Scandinavia, Iceland, and Greenland structures that had been sealed beneath volcanic ash, permafrost, and centuries of silence, and still bore evidence of thermal engineering so deliberate, so layered, so quietly intelligent that modern building scientists have had to revise their assumptions about what ancient construction was capable of. We have spent centuries imagining Viking settlements as brutal places. Smoke-choked, frozen, people enduring winter rather than living through it. That image feels earned by the harshness of the environment. Temperatures regularly reaching negative 30 degrees Celsius across the Norse world, wind chill dropping felt temperatures far beyond what numbers alone suggest, timber scarce enough that entire communities went generations without cutting a single tree for fuel. But the evidence does not support the suffering we assumed. What the evidence shows is something quieter and far more unsettling. The Vikings were not fighting winter. They were fluent in it. And the difference between fighting something and being fluent in it, that gap is where everything that matters lives. Because the Vikings never asked the question we would ask. They never said, how do we produce enough heat to survive? They asked something older, something sharper, something that changed every decision they made, from the soil packed into their walls to the animals sleeping beside their children. How do we make sure we never lose the warmth we already have? To understand how the Vikings survived, you first have to forget everything you think a house is supposed to be. A modern home is a box. It separates people from the outside world. It isolates. It divides. It consumes energy continuously just to maintain the conditions inside it. A Viking longhouse was none of those things. Archaeological remains across Scandinavia and the North Atlantic reveal structures stretching 20, 40, sometimes more than 83 meters in length. The Great Hall at Lesre, Denmark, dated to the 6th through 10th centuries, stood among the largest timber structures in early medieval Northern Europe. These were not oversized huts. They were deliberately scaled communities under a single roof. Families slept side by side. Elders worked near the hearth. Children moved through shared spaces. Labor, rest, survival, everything unfolded together. This was not poverty. This was precision. Consider the physics of what that density created. A resting adult human body continuously generates approximately 80 watts of thermal energy. 50 people gathered in an enclosed space produce roughly 4,000 watts of heat, sustained, renewable, requiring no fuel, stopping for nothing through the night. The Vikings did not heat their homes the way we do. They heated them with each other. And the shape of the longhouse was no accident either. Its gently curved walls, echoing the hull design of Viking ships, allowed wind to slide around the structure rather than strike it directly. Viking builders were sailors before they were architects. They understood how moving air behaves against curved surfaces. They brought that knowledge ashore and built it into the walls of every home they raised. But the walls themselves, that is where the deeper intelligence lived. In Iceland and Greenland, timber was rare and precious. So the Vikings did not build with wood. They built with the earth beneath their feet. Massive turf blocks were cut from the ground layers of dense soil, threaded through with living grass roots, and stacked into walls that reached up to 2 meters thick at the base. At the Norse farmstead of Stung in Iceland, preserved beneath volcanic ash since 1104, those walls still stand as evidence of what this material could achieve. The physics are straightforward. Soil contains countless pockets of trapped, motionless air. Still air is among the most effective insulators known, a principle modern fiberglass insulation still relies on today. A turf wall 2 meters thick achieves an estimated thermal resistance comparable to well-insulated modern construction standards. The Vikings did not purchase this insulation. They cut it from the ground and stacked it with their hands. Over time, grass grew back across the walls. Roots tightened every gap. The structure did not sit on the land. It became indistinguishable from it. They did not build a shelter against nature. They grew one out of it. But the walls and the bodies inside them were only two layers of this system. What the Vikings placed inside the longhouse alongside their families, that decision was stranger and more brilliant than almost anyone expects. During the coldest months of a Scandinavian winter, the Vikings brought their animals inside. Not into a separate barn, not into an adjacent structure, into the same longhouse where they slept, ate, worked, and raised their children. Cows, sheep, goats, and horses occupied large sections of the same enclosed space, separated from human living areas by low partitions, but sharing the same air, the same roof, the same warmth. To a modern mind, this sounds like a failure of civilization. It was the opposite. A single adult cow generates between 1,200 and 1,500 British thermal units of body heat per hour, the thermal equivalent of running a 350 to 440 watt space heater continuously, without fuel, without electricity, without stopping through the night. A modest herd of 10 animals produces somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 British thermal units per hour, sustained across every hour of every winter night, powered by nothing more than biology. Viking longhouse design accounted for this precisely. Livestock areas were built at a slightly lower elevation than human living spaces. Warmth, being less dense than cold air, rose naturally from the animal quarters upward into the areas where people gathered and slept. No pipes, no machinery, no additional fuel burned. Just gravity, biology, and architecture working together in a system that modern engineers would recognize immediately as passive thermal convection. Here's what that tells us about the Viking mind. The boundary between human space and animal space, the line we consider fundamental to civilization, was, to the Vikings, not a moral distinction. It was a luxury, one they could not afford, and one they were wise enough not to pretend they could. What we call primitive, they understood as integration. The animals were not tolerated inside the longhouse. They were required. Survival was never about comfort. It was about systems. But even the most efficient thermal system fails if the air around it moves freely. Heat and wind cannot coexist. The Vikings understood this with a precision that most people today have never needed to develop. Cold by itself rarely kills at the speed people fear. Wind does. At negative 20 degrees Celsius with a wind speed of 40 kilometers per hour, the felt temperature drops to approximately negative 34 degrees Celsius, a difference that can accelerate heat loss from an exposed body fast enough to become fatal within minutes. The Vikings did not fight this arithmetic. They removed the variable entirely. Viking longhouses had almost no windows. Not because glass was unavailable or beyond their skill, but because every opening in a wall was a thermal wound. A hole that bled warmth outward and invited cold inward with every shift of the wind. Darkness was a deliberate trade. Warmth was worth more than light. Entrances were kept low and narrow, forcing anyone entering to bend at the waist. This was not cultural symbolism. It was fluid dynamics. A smaller opening reduced the volume of cold air exchanged with each entry. Many longhouses added a short entry passage, an unheated vestibule that absorbed the thermal shock of outside air before it reached the living space. It functioned as an airlock. 1,000 years before pressurized spacecraft made the concept famous, Viking builders were using the same principle to protect the atmosphere inside their homes. NASA engineers and Viking longhouse builders never shared a table, but they solved the same problem, the same way. At the center of every Viking longhouse burned a fire unlike anything found in modern architecture. Not a fireplace set against a wall, not a contained furnace channeling heat through pipes and vents. A long open hearth, sometimes stretching 10 meters or more from end to end, running through the very heart of the building like a spine of living flame. At excavated sites across Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, archaeologists have found the stone-lined remains of these hearths preserved exactly where they burned, century after century, in the precise center of the structure they sustained. Beneath the fire, flat stones absorbed heat as the flames burned. Granite and similar dense rock carries a specific heat capacity of approximately 0.79 kilojoules per kilogram per Kelvin, meaning it stores thermal energy slowly and releases it even more slowly. Hours after the active fire had been reduced to coals, those stones continued radiating warmth into the space above them. The fire did not need to burn all night. The floor remembered it had. In regions where timber was scarce, peat replaced wood entirely. Peat burns at a lower temperature than timber, but far more evenly and far longer, a single compressed block sustaining combustion for hours with minimal attention. It was not the most dramatic fuel. It was the most reliable one. And in a world where every degree of warmth had to be earned and maintained, reliability mattered more than spectacle. But there was no chimney. By every modern assumption, this should have been catastrophic. Smoke should have filled the longhouse, forcing its occupants into the frozen air outside. And yet it did not. Because the Vikings understood something about the behavior of heated gas that most people today have never had reason to consider. Smoke rises. Hot smoke rises faster, and it stays high. As the hearth burned, smoke accumulated in a dense, warm layer beneath the roof, an invisible thermal blanket suspended above the living space, trapping heat below and slowing its escape into the winter air above. The inhabitants lived and breathed beneath this layer, in the cleaner air closer to the floor, where the convection currents created by the hearth kept oxygen circulating. The smoke was not a flaw the Vikings tolerated. It was a feature they managed. It did more than insulate. Soot settled continuously onto the wooden roof beams and structural supports, coating them in a preservative layer that repelled moisture, slowed rot, and drove away wood-boring insects. The longhouse was being maintained from the inside out, passively, by the same fire that heated it. At the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated to 834 AD, preserved wooden structures showed evidence of this same soot preservation effect across centuries of use. And above all of this, above the smoke layer, above the stored warmth, above the breathing community below, sat the roof. Viking roofs were not thin coverings meant simply to shed rain. They were thermal structures in their own right. Sheets of birch bark were laid across the rafters first, creating a waterproof membrane that protected everything beneath. On top of that, thick layers of turf were stacked and compressed. A finished roof could weigh several tons. That mass was not a burden, the structure merely endured. It was the point. Thermal mass slows temperature change. A heavy roof meant the warmth accumulated inside the longhouse during the day bled outward only slowly through the night. As seasons passed, grass took root across the roof surface. Roots bound the turf layers together, sealed gaps against wind and rain, and shielded the birch bark below from UV degradation. The roof repaired itself simply by being left alone. And then winter arrived, and the snow came. Modern homeowners shovel snow from their roofs out of structural concern and instinct. The Vikings left it there, because they understood what snow actually is not a threat, but a resource. Fresh snow contains up to 95% trapped air by volume. It is one of the most effective natural insulators on Earth, with a thermal resistance of approximately R1 per inch of depth. A 60-centimeter accumulation of snow across a Viking longhouse roof added the equivalent of R24 of insulation silently, freely, requiring no labor and no material cost. Entire villages disappeared beneath winter snowfall. Only narrow entrance passages and thin columns of rising smoke remained visible against the white landscape. Beneath that frozen armor, interior wall temperatures hovered far above the brutal air outside. Wind was excluded. Heat was contained. The structure had stopped being a building exposed to winter. It had become part of winter itself. Now you know how they did it. Not through brute force. Not through endless stockpiles of fuel. Not through technologies we have since lost or forgotten. Through systems. Through layering. Through a quality of attention to the physical world that most of us insulated by thermostats and double-glazed windows and gas lines running beneath our streets have never been required to develop. Every element worked together. The longhouse concentrated human bodies into a shared thermal engine. The turf walls grew insulation from the ground itself. The livestock breathed warmth upward into sleeping spaces through the night. The low doorways and vestibules sealed the atmosphere inside like an airlock. The hearthstones held heat long after the flames had quieted. The smoke layer suspended warmth beneath the roof. The turf above held it in. The snow completed the seal. Nothing was wasted. Nothing was assumed. Nothing worked alone. And here is what that asks of us. The Vikings did not have more than we have. In almost every material sense, they had less. Less fuel, less light, less space, less of everything we consider necessary for comfort. What they had instead was a different question. Not how do we generate enough to survive, but how do we preserve what we already have? That question did not only keep them warm, it kept them alive. We live in an age that worships production, more energy, more output, more heat generated, more resources consumed, more systems running at maximum capacity just to maintain conditions we have decided we deserve. And still, somehow, we find ourselves cold in ways the Vikings never were. Not physically, but in the ways that matter more in attention, in community, in the quiet intelligence of knowing how to make something last. Survival was never about having more. It was always about wasting less. The Vikings did not conquer winter. They understood it well enough that winter stopped feeling like an enemy. And somewhere in the distance between that world and this one, in the gap between what they knew and what we have since replaced with convenience, there are answers still waiting. What else have we forgotten that once kept us alive?